Now we want to start looking at authentication. And the first thing with authentication is creating a user, right? In last week during class, we went over, how to get the context database set up, all that good stuff. So I just want to take a second to review that, and then go into the exact pages where we'll have our registration signups, and go through the code and show it working and all that good stuff. So first thing, let's go over a little review here. I'm gonna collapse all these guys down. So when looking at our setup, right, our unit of work and our generic repository are the two workhorses in our database. And I'm just going to give you those by default. The generic repository you actually will never touch. It is what it is. No need to even look at that file again. The unit of work, though, you will touch. And we'll get into this later, but you should have at least one call here to the repository to tie into our user table. So what you'll do is every time you add a new table, you have to come into this file and just copy this and paste it below and put in the table name. But regardless, as long as you have the user reference in there, that's enough to start. And when we get into more tables, multiple tables, we'll look at that later. Also, what you'll get into is this Reddit context, which is essentially your database to put in the database sets, which are the tables. So user, you could have roles, you could have posts. We'll add to this too. But again, it's very similar to the unit of work. You're just going to add for every table the table. So those are the high-level database connections. They're making the connections for us, and we do little to minimum work. Once we get past that level, there's a level of C#, which is in our controllers and our models, right? And how we do this is we set up models to match our database so that we can interact with them in controllers. And the controllers dictate the data flow. So when we pass data to it, it's through a controller. And when we send data, it's through a controller, right? The models just dictate what data is being sent through and back and forth, right? So that's the C# end of it. The front end of it is our views. So in the whole application, you have a bunch of views that are tied to controllers. So you see the account, the home, manage, user, right? There's one folder here called shared that doesn't have a controller, because what this is actually the layout page. So now when we're talking on front end with MVC, we really want to know what the layout page is, because this is going to be, excuse me, sorry. This is going to be where all of our code is collected, where we can have the navigation across all pages, have the notifications or other things, maybe a footer, all of our files for JavaScript that will go across all of our pages will be placed here, our CSS. This is your typical HTML tags, doc types, headers, bodies, all that good stuff. The layout page will be a very fundamental page that you will use a lot. Beyond that, it comes down to the basic page that you're working on. So if I wanted to work on the home page, I would just open up my index page. And right now, all I have is the H1. And you'll notice there's no doc types or anything like that because it's all tied to this render body, right? So wherever the render body is in your layout is exactly where this code will go. So that H1 actually goes right inside there, right? Render sections we'll get into later. But essentially it's the same thing as a render body. It's where you're going to place code and it's going to be placed here in the layout page, right? So when we're thinking front end, HTML, these are the primary things you'll work with, your layout page and the page that you're currently on, right? Now we need to make that connection between our controllers and our front end. And how we do that is through JavaScript and Ajax. So we have the scripts folder, right? Now, I'll create a site.js that'll hold all my global variables and stuff like that. So I might have, variable user eventually that equals some sort of object user, right? And that'll be used throughout my whole site. So I just create a global kind of file there. So that's something to have. I also create, and to create a file, you just right click, add JavaScript file. Then from there, you can look at, okay, I create a methods folder or file, and this is the bread and butter between the controllers. So in this file, we will connect to the controllers by stating the controller name and the method that we want to call. The data passed back and forth will be through our data call in Ajax. And that all ties back to the models. So that's how we know what data we want to pass back and forth. Now, for our concern, we can actually go into views here, and we're going to jump into the register page. And in the register page, I've just placed some code, basic rows. I'm using the materialize library. You guys can use like Bootstrap if you want, whatever you feel comfortable with. So I have a bunch of rows here, and then I also have the section, and this section ties back to that layout, right? So in this layout page, I have render section and scripts. So as long as section and scripts is the same name, this code right here will be displayed at the bottom of the page right here, right? And I can move this around and have multiple sections if I wanted to, all that good stuff. So notice our front end here is the page I'm working on is register. I can work back on my layout and change files and update that stuff when I can. But I'm working, in the HTML, I have some input tags, my TXT, password, stuff like that. And I have a button at the end to create the user. And down here is where all the front end JavaScript, like checking if a email is valid. I just pulled this from Google, just check email validation, right? And then what I do down here is, on click is the jQuery event. On click, btn user create. I'm going to run through and I'm going to create a view model. So that's what the VM stands for. View model set to username, verify password, email. Now all this VM connects to my user create, which is our methods.js, right? So now we have, okay, I've set up my page. I know how it looks, right? I might have styled it differently or, one way or another. But then I'm going to do something. I want the user to interact with that page, right? So when I click, I'm going to do this. And now I'm going to interface the database. And how I interface the database is through this methods. I'll call this function. That function will go in the back end and call C#. So now I can go to my controller and see, oh, users, right? I can actually collapse this down. Users has one method, and that method is called create, right? So that's the connection there. My user controller users, create, right? And now when it runs this code, it's going to pass in, just like we do with our functions here, right? I pass in a view model. That view model collects the username, the password that they type in, the email that they type in, and it passes it to my function. That function then uses it and displays that information below, which passes it on to our controller. And in our controller, we can use data to access the password that they typed in, the username, the email that they typed in, all that good stuff. Once that gets through, we can do anything with it. For instance, I can check if the verified password is not equal to the password. And if it's not, I'll return an error. Password does not match, right? If it does match, then it'll move on and it'll create a user, pass in that username, create a user token, the password hash, email. And then what I've set up here are breakpoints. And these will actually stop the code at certain points and allow you to look at what's happening at that line of code. Very useful. All you have to do is click the sidebar here and set up a breakpoint, and I'll show you how that's working. So once we have that, right, we're good to go. That's the gist of the connection. Our front end is in the views. We interact with the scripts that tell the controllers and eventually tell the unit of work and the database to interact and make tables. That's it. So let's go ahead and let's try and look at this registration page. So I can go over here and I have this nifty little register page for my Reddit. Just do a quick refresh. So on the front end, I've actually done this to test. I can type in Jacob here, 123, 123. So this isn't a valid email, right? So if I submit it, not an email, right? What I'm doing there is called front-end validation, right? So validate email is this little function that I've taken from the internet, copy-pasted it, and said if it's not true, then just return a notification. So that notification lies in another JavaScript file that I use constantly throughout the layout. That'll allow me to just pop in a nice user interface that tells the user what's going on, right? Oh, you don't have an email. Oh, your passwords didn't match. You need to fill out this kind of fields. So I'll keep that as a global thing too, because I don't want to constantly call notification every time. And let's say I changed the class name, that would be miserable to go through your entire application and change the class name. So what I do is just add a JavaScript file that'll, again, globally tied to my layout page right here where it connects, and then I can always use that, right? So now that I've done some validation here, I now want to actually enter a user, right? So let's enter j@j.com. Jacob is the username. Well, actually, we'll call it Aaron. Password 123, verified password 123, they match, right? So when I submit this, now this is the advantage of the breakpoint. So what I've done is I've set one breakpoint and I've executed the create method, right? So it's stopped on that breakpoint, and I can now go in and look at user and say, okay, what's going on here? Oh, the email was set, great. The password, great. The username, the token was generated. Everything looks good. Everything looks like it's going forward. Continue. Boom. There it is, right? I've now got my object sent. That was what's sent in that register. You can actually, so the console is a very useful thing. It'll tell you what line. So that says 119. So if you click on it, you can see where that's coming from, right? The console log I got there. But what's super interesting is this return, right? So 128 is actually the function that we called to interface with the database, returning that data, right? And what that is in our backend is this little guy. So because I'm returning JSON down here, I'm returning a view model, I'm returning just the user token. If I wanted to, I could return something more. Let's actually stop this. I could return username too, right? Username. So now I can return two things. So I have a property name, set it equal to something, comma, and now I can return multiple things, right? So what this does now is, let's look at our database, right? So these are my users before, and if I execute this again, new user, yay! So got the user ID, she has her own user token, username is set, password hash. Now, everything else is good, but this is kind of evasive, right? So I don't actually want to know their password. That's not good to know as a developer. So we actually want to hash this. So we want to encrypt it, which I'll get into on a next video. But you can see that our user ID is set, our user token, it's all responding well. The next thing to do is now take this information that I return and then redirect the user to a new page saying success and logging them in, essentially. So I'll go over that at a later video.